Morning, everybody. This is another Monday. I'm going to talk about some recovery projects here. You know, when you got a recovery project, you really don't know how much trouble it's going to be or if it's going to be worth it. One time, whenever I was at the, we had just got the Jeep franchise, this guy brought a Renault 18i that looked to me like it might be worth $100 sitting beside the road with a for sale sign on it. Wouldn't run. The guy wanted it to see about what was wrong with it, and under the seat was the engine controller. It had been wet. It was an 81 model, and you could smell that it was burned up because it had been under there, and somebody had left the windows down or something that destroyed that. And so at the time you could still get a new one. It was $1,700 for a new engine controller. This was in like 1988. And I figured, well, that guy's not going to want to spend that on this junky old car. Well, he said, yeah, go ahead and fix it. So we popped that engine controller on there and got him out of the road, got him back on the road. But whenever one's been sitting as long, like for example, this old truck right here, this late 50, 57, 56, 57 model Chevy 1.5-ton truck. Well, to begin with, it's a 1.5-ton truck, and somebody might want to fix that, but it's it'd be a lot of trouble, and everything's all probably going to be rusty and locked up like it was on a black 51 Ford my uncle parked under a shed out there behind his house, and it stayed there for 30 years or something. And when he was asking my dad, "Hey, can I get this going again?" Well, everything was rusted out and locked up on that thing. This friend of mine had his Volkswagen Bug parked in a barn. It was a 73 model, and she was all excited about getting that going. She asked me about it, and I said, everything's probably going to be locked up on it. Well, the engine was locked up even, so, well, that shot that in the foot. Although some people will spend that much trouble on a Bug. You have to decide if it's worth it or not. That's the point. Well, I bought this 66 Chevy C10 when I was working at that gas station. This guy wanted to sell it for $145. And so I bought it. It had a 283 and a heavy-duty 4-speed, and I told Dad about it, and I said, yeah, I'll give you half the money. Let's go ahead and speculate on that and see if we can make a little something off of it. And so I plunked down the cash, drove it home. Didn't need a title in those days in Alabama, not until 75. This was, in other words, if it was a 75 model or newer, you had to have a title, but before that you didn't, and people would buy cars from all over the country and bring them here to sell. But anyway, so I noticed it smoked and it jumped out of fourth gear while I was driving. Well, yeah, the engine and the transmission both need work, but hey, there's a truck. And so got to the shop and I told my dad, I said, hey, come out and have a look at our truck, or my truck. And he said, our truck, and I called it my truck, he called it our truck. When he walked out and looked at it, he said, you got stuck. I said, wait a minute, it was our truck and now I got stuck? Sounds to me like we got stuck. Well, I drove it for 2 weeks without spending a penny on it, sold it for $175 and split the proceeds with Dad, so we got our money back plus a little more. Well, this 64 Chevy C10, a couple of years later, I asked Oscar, why is that the truck sitting out there by the barn with a flat tire? And he said, well, and now think about it, this truck was 12 years old at the time, and that'd be like a 2013 model now. What would you pay for what would you have to pay for a 2013 model truck, even if it was sitting in somebody's yard? And he said, well, it was running when I parked it. I bought it for $150, drove it for a while, and sold it for $200. And so that was really handy to be able to do that. When I went to the courthouse to get the tag for it, I said, hey, this truck's been sitting up a couple of years. I need a tag for it. And the lady said, hey, how much is it, differ from today's courthouse? She said, what's the serial number on it? And so I told her, the year, model of the truck, serial number, and all that. So she threw me a tag on the counter for $4 or $5 or something like that, and I popped a tag on it. And my dad had what we call garage owner's insurance, and I was covered under his insurance no matter what I was driving, which was pretty doggone handy, and it didn't cost a whole lot to have insurance because he had garage owner's insurance, Well, the 73 LTD, the friend of mine had bought, he bought it when it was only a year old. It was a really, really nice, crisp new car. And it was years later, I came home and it was sitting under a pecan tree. And I said, what's it, Danny, what's your car doing sitting under a tree? He said, well, it was just fine when I parked it because it needed a battery. And so he was going to sell it for junk. And I told him, I said, well, probably ain't much wrong with it. I'll get it running if you'll pay for the parts and give me 40% of the sale price. And so he agreed, and I did a tune-up on it, points and plugs, put a battery in it, and it fired right up, and he sold it for $325, and he gave me my 40% of that. And so, but see, the thing about it is, some of these cars can be rescued, some of them's not worth rescuing. You got to decide if it's worth spending money on, and there's all kinds of stuff you're going to run into. Newer cars with fuel injection are going to have the fuel system all clogged up, and it's going to be a lot more trouble than straightening one out that's got rotten fuel in it when it's running the carburetor. We had a 94 Ford Escort. It was an old junker car that had a manual transmission on it at the school. And if you let the gas get about 3 months old in that thing, it wouldn't start until you put new gas in it. Now it didn't clog anything up, but it was kind of like, you ever had a lawnmower that had rotten gas in it, and you pull on the thing till your tongue hangs out like a tie, won't start. You get rid of that old rotten gas that's in it and put fresh gas in there, it fires right up. That's just the way that is, But there's an awful lot more to it to get an old car going now, because old cars now have fuel injection and stuff on them. Old cars back in the day were all carbureted and all that, and had real simple systems on them. That's helping his country boy. This wasn't an old car that was parked, but he had been tinkering with it, and he couldn't get it started because he'd pulled the distributor out of it. And I was in Arkansas visiting some relatives I had at the time, and this lady says, "Hey, can you go out there and help Tommy get his Chrysler started? Don't tell him that's why you go out there, because he get mad." So I went out there, and Tommy was sitting there. I noticed that he had a dish pan, big old round dish pan, propped up over a chicken house brooder that was turned upside down so he could use it like a burner. And he'd put water in there, and he'd put coffee in there, and he'd boil that water with the coffee grounds would settle on the bottom. He'd dip him some coffee out there. That's how he made coffee, But anyway, it was an interesting place to be there, in that part of Arkansas. Some of them folks live that way, but they're good folks, So anyway, I says, I wanted to help this guy out. So he's sitting on the couch, and me and this lady's husband sat there and talked to him. And, "Hey, what's wrong with the Chrysler?" He said, "Well, I pulled the distributor out, and I can't figure out how to get it back in there and get it timed right." Well, I don't know why he pulled the distributor out. He didn't tell me. But I just said, "Let's go out there and have a look." And he said, "Sure." So we went out there and looked at the car. So I had him pull the plug, #1 plug. We found the compression stroke by bumping the engine over until it puffed. Some people put a cork in the hole and let it pop out. I just taught my students to stuff a rag in there if you're scared to put your finger in there, or and it'll push it out when the compression stroke comes up. Then you're coming up on top dead center. I says, "Now bring that balancer around until that timing mark lines up, and you'll know you're at top dead center compression on cylinder #1. And go put the distributor in there so the rotor is pointing at one of the, some of the distributor caps will have a 1 on it. Fords like to do that. If it's a Chrysler, V8 Chrysler, they just put it pointing at whichever one of these that you're going to start wiring it on." So he puts it in there, drop, it had that screwdriver type thing on the bottom that operated that ran the oil pump, and all you had to get everything so that would drop in place. Anyway, got that back in there, and we got it pointed there, and then we started at the post where we had the rotor point, and we went 1, 8, 4, 3, 6, 5, 7, 2 going clockwise, because you need to know which way the distributor turns, and you need to know the firing order, and you need to know how the cylinders are numbered on the engine. Is what you needed to know. So we wired the thing up, and I fired it up. We fired it up, and I said, "All right, I'm going to hold it up about 2,000 RPM, hold it up." So I advanced the time until it starts popping out of the carburetor a little bit, and then I brought it back until I got optimum sound from the engine, locked it all down, and closed the hood, and he was happy as a pig in slop because he had a car that would run now. Well, this 97 626 Mazda 22.5 engine sitting under a barn. It was parked because it needed a starter. So the engine ran rough after the starter was replaced. He put a used starter, which was kind of a pain. It's kind of on the back, and the way the bolts go in. If you've ever put one on one of these 90s Mazdas V6s, you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay, so listen to this starter. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? Let's compare it to a new one.
Really lousy starter.
See what the new one sounds like.
Goes on this 97.
Hear the difference?
Big difference in those two starters.
Well, we had to replace the starter, and it went bad after only a few starts. All right, so if you measure, now this is only a valid, like, let's say for example you close these switches, but the starter wouldn't work, and you went from here to that trigger wire on the solenoid, right? Which is what this is where we found the problem. This one here, of course, we didn't get exactly 12 volts, but if you were dropping all of your voltage, if these switches were closed, but you were reading 12 volts right here, it means this thing is totally inoperative, and you're just not, there's no voltage getting there, because you're basically measuring, this is going to be grounded through here, So you're going to be reading the ground through here, but this voltage is not being used except by the meter. So that's a voltage drop test. I hope I'm not confusing anybody that doesn't know anything about voltage drop. Well, we got it set on 20-volt scale. You might notice that. And this is a cheap meter, I know, but it works for this. All right, so we did a solenoid trigger voltage drop test. We close these switches. Starter's spinning really slowly. You know, this is the starter that we, burned up. So I said, this is what we got right here. We were dropping this much voltage between here. So if we got 12 volts here, we're only getting about 8 volts there. And what that means is it wasn't snapping these contacts in like it needs to, because a solenoid is basically a contactor. If you know what a contactor is, a contactor is made for high current and voltage. Whenever it closes, it's got to go really fast and really harsh in order to keep those. If it goes too slow, you get a bunch of arcing and burning here. And that's what was happening on here. It was pulling it in, but it was pulling it in so slow that every time this contact was made, it was going bzzz, and it was welding a little bit. And that was a problem because it was dropping voltage here. Well, when you start dropping voltage inside here, and I've got a video on my YouTube channel about voltage, starter solenoid voltage drop. If it's dropping voltage between here and here, then you're going to have low voltage going to the starter. When you've got low voltage going to the starter, you burn the starter up because it's like it's kind of locked up and trying to overwork. But low voltage will ruin a starter. I mean, it'll just burn it slim up. So anyway, the solenoid contactor was engaging too slow, scorching the contacts, causing voltage drop, and then it was causing the starter to burn up. That's why it burned up the replacement starter that we put on there. And there was a couple of ways we found. I think we found out there was an issue with the neutral safety switch. The guy didn't want to spend any money on the car because it was a barn car anyway. So it seems to me like, if I remember right, we ran a wire from from a good hot place on the fuse box to the solenoid trigger wire. So all he had to do was switch on the key and push the button to start it, and it didn't never burn up another starter again after that. But we bypassed whatever voltage drop he had in this start circuit. That's what we did with that. Now, it still ran bad. He had lousy fuel pressure. So this is the kind of stuff I was talking about. You pull the gas tank off and you see a bunch of this crud in here. You're really, really lucky if you haven't totally destroyed your injectors. Fuel lines all full of crud and all that kind of stuff. It's a big mess. And on these Ford pickups, and I don't know about any of the other ones, because mostly I worked on the Ford pickups that had 2 tanks on them. The rear tank's flat. The front tank's kind of like a cigar. All right, the rear tank, people won't use it for some strange reason. They don't want to fill up both tanks. They just use the front tank. So the rear tank, the gas goes bad in the rear tank, and eventually the pump goes bad. Well, I had one guy that came out there, and he was saying, my truck don't run right. And so anyway, I'd go in there and work on the truck a little bit and piddle with it and all, and figure out. Anyway, what I found out he was doing was he had rotten gas in the back tank, and he had good gas in the front tank that had been using all the time. He kept switching it to the back tank to make it run better. There was nothing wrong with the engine. He had rotten gas in the back tank. When I found out about that, I said, we're going to have to drain that rear tank. We're probably going to clean the injector. So he says, well, I put some good gas in there with it. So, well, how much good milk can you put in there with sour milk before you have a whole thing full of sour milk? You're not going to fix a tank of rotten gas by putting some good gas in there on top of it. That's stupid. But anyway, that's one way or another. We actually got this tank cleaned out. We flushed out the lines, managed to get that thing running pretty good. Now I will say later on it came back with sputtering and popping again. We found a weak ignition coil that time. And so anyway, he was driving the car. Whenever you start driving a car that's been parked, though, it's going to feel funky and wonky, and then after it limbers up and starts doing what it was designed to do, it will typically drive a whole lot better. Of course, you'll have to get the field mass out of the glove compartment, this kind of thing, but anyway. Now, they thought this was an anti-theft problem. I was asked by the fixed operations manager at the college, he says, can y'all look at this state trooper car? And I said, sure. It was a sleeper. Wouldn't start. They put a battery in it, no dice, didn't do any good. We did a voltage drop test from the positive terminal to the starter. They figured it was going to be this, ignition, because a lot of these, in those days when that ignition switch went bad, the anti-theft system would keep it from starting and all that. Did a voltage drop test. We lost 7 volts between the battery and the starter. When I pulled the battery, This right here was deceptive. This is the actual picture of the cable. And from the other side, because it had this rubber boot on it, you couldn't see this. And they didn't look at that when they changed the battery. They just changed the battery, and if you just glance at these without pulling them off to look at them, you think you're in better shape than you are. Well, we replaced this cable, and that's all that vehicle needed, like $16. They didn't want to take it to the dealer. It was a 2001 model. It was a sleeper. Now, it had a siren and lights, behind the windows and all that kind of stuff. And they managed to, pull a lot of people over because it didn't look like a cop car. They wanted to get it going again, but they didn't want to spend a ton of money on it, having it fixed anywhere else. So they asked us if we'd work on it. Obviously, the state troopers, we can work on their stuff. But because it was an old white car, anyway, one way or another. This 97 Accord started okay, but it wouldn't stop. This was one that they didn't park, but it needed to be recovered anyway because they just drove it and 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 drove it until the caliper blew. Have you ever seen anybody do that? They keep on driving. Disc brakes are designed to do that. If people ignore the scrubbing, they'll scrub till there ain't no pads left, and then they'll start using they'll do whatever they can to stop that car until you finally blow a wheel cylinder. That's why people are supposed to pay attention to noises that are coming from the front brakes. Now, sometimes they'll squeak whenever, just because of the kind of pads you got on them and all that kind of hogwash. But if that thing is worn out and you're hearing grinding, scrubbing noises, and I've seen rear brakes on some of these Lincolns to where nothing was left of the doggone surface where the pads pinched. All that was left was the hat that had the park brakes in it. I got pictures of that on here somewhere. This Expedition had a flat air spring, and they had parked it for that reason. And they had replaced one air spring, but the other one went flat, and they just got disgusted and quit driving it because they didn't want to drive it with it sagging like that. And so we sold them on replacing the rear suspension with coil springs, which really is fairly easy to do. And it comes with shock, comes with springs, doesn't cost very much, usually less than a couple $100. And it's easy to do. You can get them air springs out of there, raise that thing up on the lift, get the air springs out, work these springs in there, put of course I like to take the shocks loose from the rear axle, and so it lowers a little more. You put them coil springs back in there with their insulators and put it all back together. We did some Crown Victorias like that and some Lincolns, and I mean, we just did a whole lot of good there. Now, Bobby's first 3-valve 5-4 plug swap, he's one of my students. The plugs, this was really the first one we had done in the shop, and so the plugs, the end of that plug, because it's carboned in there, when you screw that thing out slow, it rolls that crimp back and it lets this part stay in there. And so the first one, he managed to get it out of there with JB weld, and he was really happy about that. But the next, the other one, we had to use the special tool. It was a $100 special tool you buy, so you had to punch that down, then you got this left hand thread thing you screw in there, and then it bites in there and tightens up, and you just pull that out of there. Oh, I found out, I've mentioned this before, you just jerk those things out of there with an impact wrench, you'll just about get them all out of there every time. Now, I'm going to say I didn't come up with that idea. There was a shop over close to the college that said that they were getting them out that way. And so I had this 90-degree Ingersoll Rand impact wrench, cost about $350, that we use for that, because you can't always get an impact wrench in all those places. But if you got one of those 90-degree impact wrenches, they'll impact. Not an air ratchet. It's got to be a impact wrench kind of a thing. It snatches these things out of here so fast that crimp doesn't have time to roll back, is what the deal is. And we didn't ever put anything in there to loosen them up or anything. We didn't care if the engine was hot or cold. We just jerk them out of there. And like I say, if one of them comes apart anyway, you got the tool you can use, so whatever. I will tell you that if you've used this tool very many times, you're going to have to buy another one, because those threads have a tendency to, to get to where they don't bite good after you've used it a few times. Now, these JB welder folks, they really believe in this JB weld. I know you see these people like that. A lot of people swear by JB weld, and it's got its uses, but if it doesn't work the first time, the answer is not just to put more on there. And that's what these people did. They just kept packing it on there and packing it on there, trying to stop this length. The fitting popped off even with the manifold, and it was rusty cooling all over the place. So they brought it in there. The student brought it in there to us, towed it in there, and so you chip this out of there. Got all that junk out of there, the busted off fitting, and then we went in there with a 1/2-inch natural pipe tab. Now, thread's tapered. It's not like regular bolt thread. I hope you understand that. I've done some videos on that too. Tap this out, put a fitting in there, and we were good to go. Well, here's another situation. We broke on this Nissan. This Nissan right here, this guy right here was putting a heater core in it. When he was working under there, somehow he managed to pop this little nipple off right here, off of this $200 hose that comes with this water pump and all that garbage. Now, we've replaced those too. You know, we've actually replaced them. But in this particular case, I said, I think we can fix this, because that's fairly beefy right there. So we got a 1/2-inch pipe tap, same tap that we used on that other one. Tapped some threads up in there, got some Teflon tape put on there, and screwed that right up in there and just took care of it. No problem, never came back with a leak, and that was a fix that was very similar. So, alright, this has been the end of this video. We've been here 20 minutes. Hopefully you've had time to listen to me ramble and tell stories, and I hope you'll give me some good reports on this. If you thought it was boring, let me know. But I'll see you guys next week, and thank you for tuning in.